OMB had it. I don't know if they, I don't
Good morning, everyone.
know if it's been implemented.
Good morning, everyone. Hello out there. Good morning, everyone.
Is the mic on?
Is the mic on, or am I just shouting? It's not on. Okay, well then I'll speak softly, so you have to concentrate. Good morning. We're going to spend some time now talking about the research terms and conditions. And I'd like to introduce the panelists, and then I have a brief introductory comment to make. Although I know some of you find it hard to believe that any comment I might have would be brief. But
Sorry.
nonetheless,
I did laugh a little loud there.
is that a question back there? Thank you for letting me know. What I said was I would start with a brief comment, but some of you doubt that I could make a brief comment. In any case, let me start by introducing the panelists. To my far left is the indomitable, what was your name again? Jean Feldman from the National Science Foundation. Some know her as the mother of the federal terms and conditions. Seated
And
next,
it goes downhill from there.
seated next to her is Sam Ash from the National Institutes of Health. He is not the father. He is much too young.
He's way too young.
He is the cousin.
I was going to say Michelle's adopted son.
Yeah,
Oh, okay, all right.
that'll work.
That'll work.
That'll work.
Michelle Bowles, who is listed in the program as representing the NIH, is ill, and she wisely sent her adopted son, Sam, to fill in for her. And to my immediate right is Pamela Webb, who is the great aunt of the research terms and conditions, and also Associate Vice President at the University of Minnesota. And I was about to say, I think I may be the grandfather of... But what I really wanted to... My brief comment is about the role of the FDP in the history of what now is the research terms and conditions. Way back many, many years ago, when Jean Feldman was just a young whippersnapper starting out in the research administration world, we had the FDP terms and conditions. And shortly after the Federal Demonstration Partnership was created, the FDP was searching for various ways in which there could be opportunities for the members of the FDP, both the universities and the federal agencies, to demonstrate that there was perhaps a better way, a more efficient way, a less burdensome way to manage federal grants. And one of the results of that was the development of something called the FDP Terms and Conditions. And this was really a special version or a special edition of OMB Circular A110. Now, some of you younger folks may not remember that once there was an OMB Circular A110, and it was basically the policies and procedures for grants management. And along with A21, it gave us virtually everything we ever needed to know about how to manage a federal grant. And so the FDP terms and conditions were a special set in which FDP member institutions had certain benefits that were not available to other grantees. And the idea was that if after some reasonable period of time operating under these more progressive terms and conditions. If we had not gotten into a lot of trouble, people hadn't been sent to prison, if we were still receiving funds from the federal government, then maybe these more liberalized terms could be applied more broadly. And so the FDP terms and conditions morphed into the federal terms and conditions, which were essentially the same, but they were now applicable to all recipients of federal grants from the agencies that were participating in the FDP. But when the uniform guidance was implemented, those research terms and conditions disappeared because we were no longer operating under OMB circulars A110 and A21. So the question immediately was raised, well, now what? What are we supposed to do? Are we going to have a special set of terms and conditions for the research agencies and the research grantees? And the answer was yes. And it was a group largely led by both Gene Feldman and Michelle Bowles, who undertook the task of getting all of the federal research agencies to get together to agree on an approach to terms and conditions that would relate to the uniform guidance. And that task took a lot longer than anyone ever imagined it would. And fortunately, Gene Feldman is here to tell us why. And also,
And I'll keep it clean, too.
no names need to be mentioned. In any case, Gene is going to start by presenting some slides that point out some of the important aspects of the research terms and conditions. Sam is going to comment along the way, and then Pamela and I have some questions that we would like to pose, but we also want to make sure that there's time for all of you to ask any burning questions that you have about the research terms and conditions, when all of this will occur, and how it will apply to you. So without further ado, let's turn to the mother of the research terms and conditions. And Mother's Day is coming up. In fact, isn't it this coming Sunday? So in honor of Mother's Day, we turn to Gene Feldman.
Oh, gosh. Thank you. I am going to do what I believe is just some very basic background slides to provide some context setting, as well as to, throughout the process, talk about some of the issues we've encountered along the way, which ironically, now that we've implemented the research terms and conditions, those are the same kinds of questions we actually are still receiving. So I thought that there was some benefit for putting that material in there as well. Can you be my channel changer? Can you, yeah.
There you
There we go. So Dick's already talked about the research terms and conditions and what the purpose was, which was, you know, we as a group of agencies, and let me also let you know that this does fall under a pretty well-established activity. It's a group called the Research Business Models Interagency Working Group. It is a subcommittee of the Social Behavioral Subcommittee of the Committee on Science. Try saying that fast. But when you're talking through that process, that kind of also is an indicator of why things are taking the kinds of time that they are. Anything that this group does that has an RBM name on it has to go through and be approved by the Committee on Science. And that means at the time it was John Holdren who headed OSTP, Francis Collins from NIH, Dr. Cordova from NSF. So we're talking pretty senior level representatives had to actually sign off on what it was we were proposing to do. Again, we realized that the uniform guidance was coming at that time. We said we've got no A110 anymore, and the research terms and conditions were a model implementation of OMB Circular A110, and those that remember back in those days, remember we had the full A110 on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side we made some clarifications, we supplemented some language, we made a research agency position on a number of issues. And so we said, well, you know, we've got to get this process moving. So that's exactly what we started to do. Wow, that you can't see that.
Let's see.
I got it. So this just talks about the participating agencies. And
I think actually this was intentional.
yeah, I think. Yeah, because you can't see all the agencies,
Right.
and when you see the ones that are missing, you won't be mad at me. So,
Me neither.
yeah. So this slide goes through the agencies that are participating, and what you would see on it is that the Committee of Science again in the RBM has representatives from every one of the science agencies, and even some that you're not necessarily used to thinking about because they have research components. So participating, and those that said, I want to come to the table, I want to sit around with a group of people and talk about what this next generation of RTCs would look like, was USDA, and one component of that, National Institute of Food and Agriculture. We have the Department of Commerce and NIST and NOAA were the ones, and actually the departmental level, Gary Johnson, who heads grants at Commerce, has been very active in this. A new player, Department of Homeland Security, is also playing in this activity, although they joined relatively late. When they saw the draft in the Federal Register of what these were going to look like, they said, hey, this is something that we didn't intend to initially do it, but this is something we want to do. Department of Energy, Transportation, again, an organization that you typically do not think of at all. They're very much state and local. Well, they have an entity in Atlantic City as part of the FAA that said, no, we've used the research terms and conditions in the past, and ironically, what's really cool to know about them is that, you know, they invited me to a meeting, and they said, oh, don't worry, Gene, we'll just send a plane for you. I'm going on the FAA plane.
Did you tell Michelle about that offer?
No.
I didn't think so.
So then we have EPA, our colleague, and we have EPA in the audience as well, NASA, and then of course NIH and NSF. Michelle and I have been co-chairing this function. And I think it's really, really vital for Sam to be represented here as NIH, because throughout this process I'd like Sam to weigh in, because they have been the HHS player at the table, but I know that Sam and Michelle have been doing a lot. In fact, he has a meeting right after this one to talk about other HHS octaves actually participating in this activity. But for right now, these are the ones that had been playing in the overall development.
Right. And I thank you for putting that segue in there, Gene, because I know we often receive comments from our various stakeholders and institutions as far as, you know, NIH is bought in or is a participant of the research terms and conditions. However, we know we have other research awarded agencies under the HHS umbrella that don't currently participate on the RTCs. So we've heard the concerns. We're going to take it back and have a further discussion with the department as far as being able to highly encourage other operating divisions under the HHS umbrella to participate on the RTCs. So just want to let you know the comments, the concerns have been heard, and we're going to take it back and have further discussions.
Thank you very much, Sam. Can you go to the next slide? There
you go.
So one of the
At
concepts...
least we can read this one, Jane.
Hey, I actually think it was pretty clever that you couldn't read all the
Yes, it
agencies.
was.
because,
Yes, it was.
Although that is going to come up, I can guarantee you, as part of this presentation. So the high-level concept, and I think it's vital to understand a couple of key points that Michelle and I always mention at the beginning of this. The high-level concept was that the agencies at the table bought into the fact that there is uniform guidance out there. This wasn't an attempt to just say, we're going to completely, nor frankly would OMB have allowed us to do that. And so this was very much, so the first sentences talk about this incorporating the entire uniform guidance by reference. I think that's vitally important. What we really intended to do as part of this activity is what we did the last time, to clarify or supplement select provisions where appropriate and consistent with government-wide research policy. So one definite thing that you're going to see in this is that instead of the entire uniform guidance being on the left-hand side, like we did with A110, we really only put the parts where we actually are making those kinds of clarifications supplemental, or this thing would go on, obviously, for hundreds of pages, and we did not want to do that. Another fundamental concept in the high-level concept that it's important for all of you to be aware of is that we had to think long and hard. A110 applied to whom? Universities and nonprofit organizations. The uniform guidance does not. It's much broader. It captures the entire grouping of recipients of federal assistance funds. So we had to talk right away about whom are we applying these terms and conditions to. And it was very clear right up front, as Dick started with the flexibilities, et cetera, we knew very quickly that once we left the world of universities and nonprofit organizations, our desire to be flexible got smaller and smaller. So we made a decision that we realize that the uniform guidance does apply to a lot more, but we will only be applying these to universities and nonprofit organizations. Otherwise, we would definitely be needing to limit the flexibility on many, many of the areas that you all are used to having flexibilities for.
Gene, if I can just...
Yes, absolutely.
Like many of you, I've spent my entire career in the university world. And when I think about federal grants, I think about federal grants to universities. Is there anyone else out there who gets federal grants? Well, it's hard to believe, but we're really a very small portion of the overall recipients of federal financial assistance. And even though we might think we're the most important and worthy recipients of federal financial assistance,
and we think so too. Sorry.
we really are a very tiny portion of the overall picture. And so, as Gene pointed out, the uniform guidance is directed at all federal financial assistance, not just research and not just awards to universities. And so that made the research terms and conditions even more critical today than they were under the previous arrangement, where we were just dealing with a couple of OMB circulars that were primarily aimed at us to begin with.
Thanks a lot, Dick. One other, couple other points in general about the overlay that I think it's important to understand. In fact, it's vital for you to understand, is that we had a rule we used, that if a couple of agencies supported something, in many ways flexibilities, we would go ahead and put that in the, and I'm going to give some examples of where that may play out. we were going to incorporate those into the overall concept, hoping that we would get others to join us on those particular issues. And that's going to play out in the actual implementation piece of this. But you need to be aware that the provisions that are on the right-hand side, some of them actually may be addressed in a given agency's agency-specific requirements. And you definitely need to understand that. The last thing is that on the bottom of this slide is the listing of agencies. So what we did in terms of the Federal Register notice that announced these was identify the agencies that were going to participate in this. We also, at the request of OMB, the Office of Federal Financial Management, we asked other agencies to join us in this activity. So it's not a matter as simple as just saying, oh, we're just going to do this. We, as you see the rollout, will need some input from those organizations in terms of the overall implementation. So the ones I've talked about are the ones participating as of right now.
Jean, can I ask a question about that? Does that mean if we are able to invite and get other agencies to join the RTCs, that they will need to go through a formal Federal Register or other process in order to be able to join in?
No, they will not. What they will need to do, and this is a good question to take care of now, is that when you see the kinds of materials that are incorporated by reference into this document, you'll see that we have needs for input from them to complete what the full package is. And that means that they're going to need to provide to us some materials. This is worth mentioning a couple of times. They're going to need to provide input to the prior approval matrix so that we have a holistic listing of all of the prior approvals. We need to get information from them on what kinds of terms and conditions flow down to various types of subawardees. We need to get their agency-specific requirements. And I know folks are saying, well, we would rather they not have any. Well, the bottom line is that there are places where we up front say for administrative issues like this, you go to this office. You go on this kind of office to program, and we give you some basic background information that you do need irrespective of what your agency is. So we are very much, and my staff, this is when they want to put their hands around my neck and say, Jean, just shut up and let it be these agencies, because this actually does take work. I mean, it means modifying documents, it means addressing websites, it means a lot of things, but we are dedicated to doing that to make this as much of the research portfolio as we can. So next slide.
And just to piggyback on that,
Yeah.
Jean, just to reiterate, like you said before, we're going to mention it a couple of times throughout the presentation, that we have the overarching overlay document, and what we discussed initially was that if there's more that, well, I think it was, like we said, a couple of agencies, if they want a particular provision, then that provision was identified within the overlay document. Mm-hmm. However, if there wasn't more than a couple of agencies, then we asked them to include that within their agency-specific requirements, which is a document that accompanies the overarching overlay document.
Right.
So just to put that out there one more time, and it'll probably be mentioned a couple of other times throughout the presentation.
Okay, so let me talk about one of the fundamental things I said was that these research terms and conditions are meant to supplement, clarify, take an agency position on. So I thought that it might be nice to just give you an idea of some of those select ones. And this first one, 200.17, is named in honor of Cindy Hope, who didn't like it the first time NSF mentioned it and made it a term and condition, and then we had the audacity to get NIH to do it, and now everybody's doing it. So
wrong.
Yeah, I know. It is what it is, okay? So in the cluster of programs, it identifies the types of programs that share, of course, common compliance requirements, and R&D is one of those, as you all well know. Well, the RTCs specifically state that all awards that incorporate the research term, she's giving me this.
I'm okay with this one.
Yeah.
It makes sense that it's research if you're giving research terms
Yeah,
and conditions.
yeah.
It's the broader thing.
Yeah, well, you're still not going to be happy. Okay, so all awards that incorporate the RTCs meet the definition of research and development, and auditees should identify them as part of the R&D cluster on the SEPA. So we made a definite statement that if these are incorporated, they're R&D, by definition for all of those agencies on there. Next slide. Performance measurement. This has come up in so many interagency discussions recently, which had OMB at the table, that it's vital that folks understand that this is actually in there. And this is something that was very controversial when the uniform guidance first came out for comment. And it basically outlines the requirement that the federal awarding agency must require the recipient to relate financial data to performance accomplishments of the federal award. Also, in accordance with above-mentioned standard information collections, and when applicable, recipients must also provide cost information to demonstrate cost-effective practices, example through unit cost data. Well, at the very beginning of the conversation, research institutions, the National Science Board, OSTP-related concerns, that wait a minute, that, just because you said you were going to do X in science doesn't automatically have that unit cost type correlation of what actually comes out at the end. And we were very, very concerned about that language. And so, in the Federal Register notice announcing the uniform guidance, there was a statement that addressed all the comments that came in on this topic. And it said, for awards that support research, there is a standard information collection method, the Research Performance Progress Report for performance, that does not relate financial information to performance data. Therefore, there is no requirement. So that language is not in the uniform guidance itself. It came out in a Federal Register notice, and so when we plopped this language right next to the performance management, we got feedback, well, no, that's not exactly right. Even on a research award, when we were talking through the clearance process, we were getting pushback. And I said, well, that language is out there. And they're going, no, we don't. So I provided them with the language from the Federal Register notice. And that's why it was vital to get this incorporated here, because this is a definite message that reiterates what that initial discussion was, that if it were not in there, this language would long be forgotten. And I fear that, some things very much could have happened a long way down the road when people forget that this language was, and this issue was very much addressed initially. Yes?
So, we talked about when RTC is mentioned in an award, it means that the award is research and development. But we've been getting awards that also include clauses that restrict dissemination of information and control from classified information. So when we have...
And who are those from, for example? Because we don't have those. I'm sorry, you're just going to have to call somebody out. Yeah, but those are not...
What was the agency again? I'm sorry.
ARPA-E, is it?
Intelligence
No, IARPA.
Oh, God.
They're not
Are-
a, they're
They're not a part, they're not a
participant agency.
participant in the research terms and conditions.
Are you speaking about a grant award?
Yes, a grant award.
A grant award, federal financial assistance, that has that sort of requirement?
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, and we see the agency-specific requirements, I've not seen anything of that nature in the listing of agencies that are referenced in the research terms and conditions portfolio.
Is DOD part of it? I think that's it.
Oh,
No, DOT is not part of this. You can ask that question anytime you want. That's not part of my presentation.
yes.
Well,
Yeah.
Gene, should we go back to the slide that has the participant
hang on,
agencies?
just one
Oh,
second.
but then
Yeah.
I can really see it.
Yeah.
One other comment. Despite the wonderfulness of the research terms and conditions, and the reasonableness and rationality of all that, if an agency adds additional terms and conditions and requirements to a specific award, those take precedence over the research
Absolutely.
terms and
Absolutely.
conditions. So, first of all, if the particular agency that you're talking about is a DOD agency, they're in a different world. And we have a visitor from that world who is sitting in the back of the room, slinking under his chair at the moment, who can explain what the difference is.
Yes, that might be it might be helpful to just do it now.
Well, IARPA is not part of DOD.
Oh, great, sit down.
We don't even know. I mean, they're definitely not a participant here in this.
Yeah, but it's possible they just decided to use it even though
Yes,
they're not
right.
part of the group. So that's, I suspect, what happened. But for DOD, we have our own terms and conditions. Most folks know it.
Can you want to come up and use the mic so that people could hear you? I don't know that this is
How
going
many
to...
of you were here yesterday morning when Debbie Raffi spoke about the changes at ONR?
Yeah.
She now reports to a 2-star admiral, remember that part? Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, Debbie introduced me yesterday. I'm now Debbie Raffi.
Join the crowd.
Yeah, that's right. We're in the same one. Up until February, I was in a grants policy job for DOD. Mark Herbst, who many of you know, I took over his position until February. So DOD had their proposed rule out to change the Dodgers to implement the uniform guidance. We had a different approach in which we were trying to have standard terms and conditions that would apply to all of our financial assistance. So in DOD, we have $4.5 to $5.5 billion worth of financial assistance. About 50 to, I'm guessing it's somewhere around 50 to 60% is research. So we really wanted a holistic approach. So, you know, with the uniform guidance thought that we really wanted uniformity within DOD, particularly for those non-research elements. So in DOD, most grants officers are also contracting officers. So we have this concept of having prescriptions and then standard articles. That was our approach, and it's very intuitive for contracting officers. So we had a proposed rule that was out. Comment period ended in February, and before I left, we at least rounded up all the comments and agreed on approach forward. But we haven't finalized the final rule yet, and so since I've left, we have the position open. It was just announced, and so hopefully we'll fill that position, and that new person can carry over the goal line. But everyone's seen on the ONR website, there is the DoD research terms and conditions that are basically an implementation of what we're trying to do in our regulatory rules. So it's basically what it will be, other than there's a few deviations that we would seek through OMB that aren't in that yet. But by and large, it's going to look the same after the regulation goes into effect. So we like our approach. It's going to create uniformity within DoD. And I believe ours doesn't mention the cluster element that you were mentioning. We have that sort of in a separate, it's not attached to the terms and conditions. We now have a standard format, not a form, but a format. And within what we're calling the award cover pages, the first 2 pages, it'll indicate what cluster is separate than the terms and conditions. So,
So if I may ask you a question,
okay.
why does DOD keep including restrictions on the dissemination of information when you know that the research is
Fundamental research?
basic research, it's not classified?
Yeah, so we have a memo within DOD that's supposed to restrict that, but IARPA is not part of DOD, so they're on the intelligence side.
Yeah,
So-
but I do a lot of other DODs as well, and I see that.
So if you're seeing that, I encourage you to call Robin Staffen, where he's the director of basic research, and has oversight over that. So if you're seeing issues with that, we want to know about it. So,
I can support the CUI claim.
Okay.
We had contracting officers that had to be included in the supply chain.
yeah, let us know about that, and we will reach out to those people.
These terms and conditions in a grant, they're
We live in a very complex world. And we need to be reminded of that from time to time. Also, we need to be reminded that as there are many paths to truth, there are many paths to uniform guidance, apparently. And you're hearing from the two major paths this morning, DOD and the rest of the federal government. And I hesitate to pick on DOD because some of my best friends work at DOD, and I think their intentions are generally quite honorable. But just remember, it's a different path to the same goal.
Thanks, and thank you very much for providing that context that it wouldn't have been appropriate for us to provide. So let me just use one more example, slide down. Oh no, it's on this one, on the closeout one, because this is one of those ones I definitely wanted to use and as example of, we got language in there, but you really have to look closely at the language. And that has to do with the 90-day closeout provision that many of you have already commented on during the uniform guidance implementation process. And so NSF, NIH, and DOE were very supportive of the 120 days to give sufficient time for you to get that information on from your subawardees, et cetera. And so 120 days is the optive language in the actual RTCs. I have to tell you that of all the issues that we faced at the table, this was probably the most contentious. A number of agencies just said, we've got a different approach, and we will definitely be including that in our agency-specific requirements and their prior approval section. So that leads finally into the last one that says that there is a listing of all prior approval requirements, and what the RTCs have is a listing of all waived prior approval requirements and those that do require prior approval. Next slide. So there are these companion documents. The one I want to focus on most heavily, actually, go to the next slide, is the prior approval matrix. Now, the reason that this slide is important is that...
And obviously, you can all read the details of this.
Yeah, but I mean, the concept is there. It's got every single prior approval requirement in the uniform guidance. And then it has an RTC position, and then it lets each agency. So at the end, there's a column for NSF, DOE, and NIH. When you see the implementation, you will see that there are different implementation dates by agencies. That was something that we talked a lot about, but if we were going to have one date, it would have been much further into the future, because that was what some of the agencies needed in order to get their implementation packages done and cleared. So the next one up on the slate, talked about yesterday by Melanie Krismanich. Melanie, are you here? Yes, she's in the very, very back. NIFA is USDA NIFA. is supposed to come up next in June, and they will be providing us their information in order to populate, and we will simply add another column on this table. And I tell you, this will be definitely vitally important, because it will be the one document that lists. And when we take that extra step of, they give it to us, we populate it, and then we send it back to them and say, is this correct? Because we want to have and make sure that the information on here is as accurate as possible.
How many of you ever took a chemistry class in high school or college? And in most chemistry classrooms, what do they have hanging on the wall? The periodic table of the elements. This is our periodic table of the elements. But we only have 3 agencies listed so far. So by next year, when all of the other agencies, maybe even including DOD, have joined, it will require several screens to see the entire matrix of prior approval requirements. But it's really important to have that handy and to keep that in mind as you are advising people on what they can and can't do under a particular grant.
Can I just add one thing to that too? I think this may be one of the most important, critical elements
I think so too.
of the entire RTCs, because, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, it's a lot longer than the old one. And then I realized it was because they had done all the heavy lifting of going through and pulling out every single prior approval, as you said, that's in the uniform guidance. So we don't have to now anymore, if it's an RTC award, we have this immediate reference tool, and I just have to congratulate you for doing that, and for the other agencies that'll join, to make it easier for us to implement and for us to have a much more rapid and quick understanding of areas where we need to point out differences. So thank you.
You're welcome, and I think it's worth the effort because of what a treasure trove of information is in here. And we have actually would encourage you, not only because agencies are continuing to populate the rows, but also there's been points where people have made comments to me, they've made comments to DOE about, maybe we're a little unclear about that prior approval. So this is a document you want to look at frequently to make sure that if there are any questions about a prior approval, this is where you go to look for it. Next one, oh, sorry.
Do you have a time frame when the other agencies?
It's coming up.
Yep.
You're welcome. This is just, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Mark Schiffman, raise your hand back there. Mark is the Associate Director of NCURA, and I was going to recommend to NCURA, which does a lot of good work for the research administration community, that you might want to start publishing wall-hanging size versions of the prior approval matrix. And but if you're going to use the NCURA logo, it has to be very tiny and in the bottom of the slide. This is the government stuff.
We'd like to pilot Caltech, if that's okay with you.
That's fine.
Okay, so this just shows the subaward matrix, and these are what requirements apply to every recipient type. It goes well beyond universities and nonprofit organizations. Actually, that's where it becomes the most valuable. What kinds of terms and conditions an agency would flow down. At the bottom, you have 3 rows again. These are rows, not columns, for NSF, NIH, and DOE. And as we populate, there will be new rows added. The National Policy Matrix is a matrix of all, not all of them, but the biggest ones that come to mind that apply if it is a research award. And then one of the things I want to emphasize, we did get comments, and unfortunately the comments we got are still the comments we're getting. The themes throughout the process were places where they felt language needed to be clarified, places where you all wanted to see deviations from the uniform guidance. You tried OMB, you didn't get that, so you're trying again. And the answer was, well, no. There are, in our document, there are no deviations from the uniform guidance. Here's another point. One of the concerns that we definitely received very loudly was the role of the FAQs in the process. And at various parts of our draft overlay implementation on the right-hand side, we would plug in, oh, and here's FAQ X that states this to try to make or emphasize a point. Well, what we heard back through the comment process was that IGs and auditors did not take the FAQs in the same way as the actual uniform guidance. So to resolve that issue, we incorporated by reference the frequently asked questions. And so hopefully that, not hopefully, that gives it the same level of term and condition as the uniform guidance itself. That's point number one. Point number two is if you've looked at the frequently asked questions, they just keep adding to them. So there's no archive, when did this one start and when did that one take effect? And so we got agreement from OMB that they would begin dating them. And then so the language in the overlay states, incorporate the set of frequently asked questions in effect at the time the award is made, so that there will be no ambiguity about what you were required to do or not, because an FAQ came later and wasn't in effect for that particular. So I thought that was important to reiterate. Go ahead. The last piece in terms of the concern process is something kind of like that we just discussed. It was this concept of, we love what we see, but why isn't it everyone? And we love what we see, but we really want one implementation. We don't want some agencies coming on at some date, and then another set, and another set. And those were the realities that Michelle and I worked very, very hard to address, but could not actually get an agreement as to what that one date would look like. And we were very anxious, certainly NSF, NIH, and DOE, to implement as soon as possible. So that's what we did. When we went through the OMB review, this is just a listing of them, but there are not very many changes that were really incorporated as a result of that process. Next slide.
Jean, while you're on that one though, can
Yeah.
I just ask, why did OMB not allow the waiver of prior written approval for fixed price subawards?
That one actually is quite simple. They said that what you're attempting to do is a deviation. If you want to do a deviation, then have at it and come forth with us with the request. We were unsure how long that process would or could take, and so we opted to go forward with the language that's in the uniform guidance.
Right. And I can just speak to NIH's implementation as well. I know we did, Pam, we had a discussion as far as the NIH grants policy statement that was issued in FY 2015, well, last year, the grants policy statement waived that prior approval requirement. However, after further discussions through the RTCs and with OMB, when the language is changed and OMB said that would necessitate a deviation from the regulation, we did add that prior approval back to the NIH grants policy statement, so it's aligned with the research terms and conditions.
But as I understand it from our conversation, if we put a request in a proposal
Yes.
to indicate that we're going to use a fixed amount, a fixed price subaward, and we fulfill the requirements of the UG, then receipt of that award will constitute prior approval.
Yes.
Go ahead, no, go.
Oh, yes. From an NIH perspective, yes, that is correct. So with it being identified within the application and that application subsequently being awarded, then that serves as prior approval. for
Yes,
pre-award.
we just need to all make sure that we're making clear that not only is the subaward in the proposal, but we indicate our intent, if applicable, to issue a fixed price subaward.
And I will tell you that that's pretty fundamental concept throughout the entire uniform guidance, where it will say that it was in the original proposal or it received explicit prior written approval after the award is made. To make clear that if you're making that clear to the agency, by having that in there when the award is made, you have that constitutes prior approval. Yes, there was a question?
With the incorporation of the FAQs, the research terms and conditions, can we expect that NSF auditors will now not cite universities for exercising their rebudget authority and increasing PI salaries?
We've already addressed that with our Office of the Inspector General over a many month process. And we are seeing, it's just not coming up in audit reports the way it has in the past. But that was just painful, and we'll leave that for another day. Okay, so, oh yeah, was there another question?
Question over here?
Yes.
On the idea that the budget justification is sufficient to require approval, would that apply, like you mentioned, Sam, that's true for NIH. Would we need to have each agency say that, or because it's implied in each agency?
Well, the uniform guidance really does address that. I mean, it really says if it's in the approved application is actually what the language is. So some agencies will take different